My father announced he was disinheriting me in front of the whole family at Christmas dinner, so I calmly told him to check his bank account. I didn't just run his company. I had built a fortress around its finances, and he never saw the trap I had set. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The crystal glasses on the dining table seemed to vibrate with tension. Outside, a gentle snow was falling, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white that felt like a mockery of the storm brewing inside. Every year, my father, Arthur, insisted on hosting a grand Christmas dinner in the house I grew up in, a house built by the company I now ran. And every year, the atmosphere grew a little colder, a little more strained. This year, it was about to shatter. I sat stiffly, a dull ache spreading through my chest. For weeks, I'd been battling a nasty bout of pneumonia, and the doctor had warned me against any stress. Yet here I was, willingly walking into the lion's den. My father, with his new, polished partner, Isabel, smiling thinly beside him, raised his glass. Every eye turned to him. His voice, once a source of comfort, now boomed with a theatrical authority that made my skin crawl. "I have an announcement," he began, his gaze sweeping over my sister Alina and her husband David, before finally landing on me with chilling finality. "Effective immediately, Margaret is no longer a part of this family or its legacy. You are disinherited." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A gasp escaped my mother's lips. Alina shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. I felt the color drain from my face, the room tilting slightly. It wasn't just the public humiliation or the loss of my birthright. It was the cruel, deliberate timing. He had waited until I was at my weakest, surrounded by the family I had worked my entire life to support. He had tried to break me, but as I met his cold, unwavering stare, a quiet strength bloomed in the pit of my stomach. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The immediate aftermath was a blur of feigned shock and thinly veiled satisfaction. My brother-in-law, David, rushed to pat my father on the back, murmuring about difficult decisions and protecting the family. Alina, ever the dramatic, dabbed at her dry eyes with a napkin, her expression a perfect mask of sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes. Only my mother looked truly devastated, her face pale as she stared at her plate, unable to speak. I pushed my chair back, the screech of wood against the marble floor cutting through the whispers. "May I be excused?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Arthur waved a dismissive hand, already basking in Isabel's fawning attention. I walked out of the dining room and into the cold, sterile air of the grand foyer, my reflection in the polished floor, a ghost of the woman who had walked in an hour earlier. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my father, sent from the head of the table just a few feet away. "Pack your things. I want you out of the guest house by morning. Isabel needs the space for her art studio." The cruelty was breathtaking. He wasn't just cutting me off, he was erasing me. I sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, the cold seeping through my dress. My mind, however, was sharp and clear, the fog of illness replaced by a chilling clarity. They thought I was weak, a victim. They thought the company, the money, the power, it was all his to give and take away. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who held the keys. For 10 years, I had poured my life into sterling construction. When my father decided to retire at 58, the company was stable but stagnant. I took the reins as COO and transformed it. I diversified our portfolio, modernized our operations, and tripled our profits. I worked 18-hour days, sacrificed relationships, and poured every ounce of my energy into securing the legacy he had started. I did it all for him, for the family. In the beginning, he was proud. But as my success grew, so did his resentment. He remained the founder, the figurehead, but I held the real power and he couldn't stand it. Then came Isabel. She arrived like a character from a novel, impeccably dressed, with a vague profession as an art consultant, and an accent that changed depending on her audience. She was a master of flattery, hanging on Arthur's every word and making him feel like the titan of industry he used to be. I saw through her immediately. During our first meeting, she'd admired a painting in my father's study. "A true masterpiece," she'd cooed. "It must be worth a fortune." Her eyes, however, weren't on the art. They were on the gold leaf frame, her gaze lingering a second too long. Her questions were never about the business itself, but about its assets. "Arthur tells me the company owns several properties downtown. How fascinating," she'd say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She expertly stoked the embers of my father's insecurity, convincing him that my competence was a threat, that my careful financial strategies were attempts to steal his company. He was a proud man, and Isabel played on that pride like a virtuoso, turning him against the one person who had always protected his interests. The shock of my father's declaration quickly hardened into resolve. Sitting on that cold staircase, I didn't cry. I strategized. For the past year, as Isabel's influence grew, I'd felt a growing sense of unease. I had hoped my father would see through her, but hope was not a business plan. It was time to activate the contingency I had put in place long ago. Years prior, during a volatile market downturn, I had convinced Arthur to restructure the company's finances to protect our assets. With his full, signed consent, I had created an ironclad corporate trust. All company profits, liquid assets, and operational capital, millions of dollars, flowed directly into this trust. As the acting COO and the sole trustee, only I could authorize transfers or significant expenditures. My father's lavish lifestyle, his personal accounts, even the funds for this very Christmas dinner, were all funded by quarterly dividends paid out from that trust, at my discretion. He had forgotten the details, lost in the fog of his ego and Isabel's whispers. He saw the company as his personal piggy bank, but I had turned it into a vault. Now it was time to lock the door. I left the house without another word and drove not to the guest house, but to my office. The city was silent, the streets empty. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of my office, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was no longer just a family dispute, it was a corporate battle. I didn't need a private investigator. I had something better, the company's forensic accounting team. I made a call. "I need a full workup on an Isabelle Dubois," I said to our head of security, a man whose loyalty I had earned long ago. "Financials, associations, past addresses, I want to know everything." I was no longer the victim. I was the COO, and I was about to execute a hostile takeover of my own life. 2 days after Christmas, my father summoned me to his study. The festive decorations had been packed away, leaving the house feeling cavernous and cold. He sat behind his large mahogany desk, the picture of authority, with Isabel perched on the arm of his chair, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. My sister, Eleanor, and her husband, David, stood near the fireplace, a makeshift jury ready to witness my final humiliation. "Margaret," Arthur began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We need to discuss the transition. I will be appointing a new COO, and I expect your full cooperation." I remained standing, my hands clasped calmly in front of me. "There's nothing to transition," I said evenly. "The company is financially secure." Isabel let out a small, tinkling laugh. "Darling, what your father means is that he will be taking back control of his finances." "Is that so?" I asked, turning my gaze to my father. "Have you checked your personal bank account today, Dad?" A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "What are you talking about?" he blustered. "I'm talking about the quarterly dividend payment. There was a discrepancy in the end-of-year reports, so I was forced to halt the transfer pending a full review. As trustee, it's my duty to protect the company's assets." The color drained from Arthur's face. Isabel's perfectly manicured hand tightened on his shoulder. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "It means," I said, letting the words hang in the air, "that the well is dry, there is no money." Arthur fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he logged into his bank app. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched his eyes widen in disbelief, then darken with fury. "It's empty," he whispered, staring at the screen. "What did you do?" "I did my job," I replied calmly. "I protected the company just like you always taught me to." The immediate aftermath of the reveal was chaos. Isabel shrieked about theft and lawyers, her carefully constructed facade crumbling to reveal the avarice beneath. My father, sputtering with rage, lunged for the phone to call his bank, only to be told what I already knew. The trust was impregnable and the trustee's decision was final. He was powerless. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. Eleanor and David called me relentlessly, their voices alternating between threats and pleas. "Dad can't even pay his club membership, Margaret," Eleanor cried, as if it were a matter of life and death. "You're destroying this family." But the true bombshell came from the report I had commissioned. The FI. That landed on my desk was thicker than I had anticipated. Isabelle Dubois was not an art consultant. She was a predator. She had a history of targeting wealthy, older men, leaving a trail of drained bank accounts and broken hearts across Europe. Her real name was Helena Novick, and there were 2 outstanding warrants for her arrest in connection with fraud cases. The art she sold my father was worthless, bought for a pittance and sold for a fortune. She was a professional. I called another family meeting, this time on my turf, the company boardroom. I laid the file on the polished table. "Before you say anything," I said to my father, who looked tired and gaunt, "you need to see this." I watched as he read through the report, his face shifting from denial to shock and finally to a deep, gut-wrenching shame. Isabelle, who had insisted on attending, tried to dismiss it all as lies, but the evidence was irrefutable. Flight manifests, bank statements, even a testimony from another one of her victims. Eleanor and David stood silently, their opportunism finally silenced by the sheer scale of the deception. The spell was broken. My father looked up from the papers, not at Isabelle, but at me. For the first time in years, I saw not a resentful old man, but the father I remembered, vulnerable and utterly lost. The final showdown took place not in a boardroom, but at my mother's New Year's Eve charity gala, the biggest social event of the season. Arthur, humbled and broken, had asked me to handle the situation, to excise the cancer he had invited into our lives. Isabelle, however, was not one to go quietly. She arrived at the gala on the arm of another elderly tycoon, already sinking her claws into her next victim. She moved through the crowd as if nothing had happened, a queen in her court. I watched her from across the ballroom, feeling a cold, calm certainty. My father and I had planned this. As the host, my mother stepped up to the microphone to give her welcoming speech. When she finished, she paused. "And now I'd like to hand it over to my daughter and the COO of Sterling Construction, Margaret Sterling." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. I walked onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces, my gaze finally landing on Isabelle, whose smile had frozen on her face. "Thank you, Mother," I began. "Tonight, we are here to support a wonderful cause, one that helps protect the vulnerable in our community. It's a cause that has become deeply personal to my family recently, as we've had to confront a predator in our own lives." I didn't need to say her name. Every eye in the room swiveled to Isabelle. I calmly and systematically laid out the facts, not the family drama, but the cold, hard evidence of financial fraud. I spoke of shell corporations, worthless art, and a history of deceit. As I spoke, 2 uniformed police officers entered the ballroom and moved discreetly towards Isabelle. Her new companion recoiled from her as if he'd been burned. She stood for a moment, completely and utterly alone, her mask of sophistication stripped away to reveal the common criminal beneath. My father, watching from the side, took a deep breath and walked to the stage. He took the microphone from my hand. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "has not only saved our company, she has saved me." He turned and embraced me, and for the first time in a decade, it felt real. The room erupted in applause. Isabelle, or rather, Helena Novick, faced multiple charges of fraud. With the evidence my team had uncovered and the testimony of her other victims who came forward, the case against her was airtight. Her assets were frozen, and she was left with nothing. The media had a field day with the story of the high society grifter, but I made sure my family's name was protected. I used our corporate legal team not for revenge, but for justice, ensuring the process was swift and decisive. My relationship with my father began a slow, awkward path to healing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. He started visiting the office, not to interfere, but to learn, asking questions about the projects I was managing and listening, truly listening, to my answers. We would never go back to the way things were, but we were building something new, something based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. Eleanor and David, facing the reality that the family coffers were no longer open for their whims, were forced to become self-reliant. Their attitude towards me shifted from resentment to a grudging admiration. My mother, relieved to have her family back together, became the gentle glue that helped mend the remaining fractures. A few months later, my father officially signed over his remaining shares in the company to me, a quiet acknowledgement that the legacy was in the right hands. That evening, we sat together in his study, not as adversaries but as partners. The house was quiet, the ghosts of Pa. Tea conflicts finally laid to rest. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not only survived but thrived. I had protected my family's legacy, not by being a dutiful daughter, but by being a smart, strategic leader. The company was safe, my family was healing, and I was finally at peace.